Welcome back to Econ Empires. Imagine the driest place on Earth. Not a metaphor, not a poetic image, the literal scientific record holder for aridity on the planet. Parts of the Atacama Desert in northern Chile have never received a single drop of rain. No rivers, no groundwater, no plants. In some corners of this desert, NASA uses the soil to test Mars rover instruments because the environment is close enough to the red planet. And yet, for roughly 40 years, from the 1880s to the 1920s, this strip of barren nothing became the most strategically important piece of real estate on the entire planet. Not because of oil, not because of gold, not because of location or climate or human ingenuity. Because of a white powder sitting just beneath its surface, sodium nitrate, Chilean saltpeter, called, with complete seriousness, the white gold of the industrial age. This powder did something nothing else on Earth could replicate at scale. It made soil fertile, and it made weapons lethal. Without it, European farms couldn't grow enough food to feed their exploding urban populations. Without it, armies couldn't manufacture gunpowder. The world was running on nitrate, and Chile had almost all of it. In 1879, 3 countries went to war over this powder: Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. The conflict would be called the War of the Pacific, a name that makes it sound clean and distant, like a naval exercise. It wasn't. Over 4 years, armies marched through the same brutal desert that held the treasure they were fighting over. Tens of thousands of soldiers died. From combat, from thirst, from disease. Cities were occupied, civilians suffered. The war produced atrocities still discussed with pain in Peru and Bolivia today. When it ended in 1884, the map of South America had been redrawn in ways that have never been corrected. Chile absorbed the nitrate-rich territories of Tarapacá and Antofagasta. Peru lost its southernmost provinces. And Bolivia. Bolivia lost something it will never recover: its coastline. Bolivia became a landlocked nation after the War of the Pacific. It has been landlocked for 140 years. To this day, Bolivia maintains a navy on Lake Titicaca, a high-altitude inland lake. It is a navy with nowhere to sail. The country celebrates Day of the Sea every March 23rd, a national day of mourning for an ocean it lost over white powder. Remember that detail, because this is what a resource war actually costs. Not just treasure, but geography. Not just money, but identity for generations. Chile, meanwhile, had won everything. It now controlled the most valuable resource in the industrial world, with a geographic monopoly that seemed impossible to break. What followed was extraordinary. Between 1880 and 1920, nitrate exports accounted for more than half of the Chilean government's total revenue. Not 10%, not 20%, more than half of everything the state collected came from this one substance being dug out of one desert. National income multiplied. Railroads stretched across a country that had struggled to connect its long, thin geography. Ports expanded. Santiago was modernized with buildings that wouldn't have looked out of place in Buenos Aires or even Madrid. By 1900, Chile had one of the highest per capita incomes in Latin America. Foreign investors poured capital in. British companies, in particular, owned enormous shares of the nitrate operations, a fact that would quietly matter later. From the outside, it looked like a nation ascending. From the inside, the rot had already begun. Here is the mechanism of the resource curse, and it's important to understand it clearly, because it doesn't look like a curse when it's happening to you. It looks like success. When a government earns the majority of its revenue from a single commodity, it slowly stops needing its citizens to be productive. In a normal economy, the state needs a thriving private sector because taxes on wages, profits, and commerce are how governments fund themselves. This creates an implicit bargain. The government must create conditions where business can flourish. Good institutions, rule of law, education, infrastructure. A resource state doesn't need that bargain. The money flows regardless. The desert pays the bills whether the citizens are educated or idle, whether industry is thriving or stagnant, whether the government is competent or corrupt. So Chile's political class, the wealthy nitrate barons, the landowners, the merchants who built their fortunes on saltpeter, had every incentive to protect the existing order, and almost no incentive to build something new. Why build factories when the desert was a factory that ran itself? Why invest in education when you could hire cheap labor to dig? Why innovate when the world had no alternative to what you were selling? This is how the resource curse actually works. Not through corruption alone, though there was plenty of that. It works by making the right choices unnecessary and the comfortable choices irresistible. In 1909, in a laboratory in Karlsruhe, Germany, a chemist named Fritz Haber accomplished something that had eluded scientists for a generation. He learned to pull nitrogen directly from the air. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. Humans breathe it constantly, exhale it constantly, and it passes through us without interacting with our bodies in any useful way. The challenge was never scarcity of nitrogen. The challenge was that atmospheric nitrogen is incredibly stable. The two atoms bond so tightly that they resist almost every attempt to break them apart and recombine with other elements. Haber cracked it. Using high temperature, high pressure, and a catalyst, he found a way to force nitrogen and hydrogen together into ammonia. Ammonia, a form of nitrogen that could be converted into fertilizer, into explosives, into the entire chemical chain that Chilean nitrate had monopolized. Carl Bosch then industrialized the process. Scaling it from laboratory curiosity to factory reality, Chile had lost its monopoly. It just didn't know it yet. But here's where this story becomes something more than economics. Fritz Haber is one of the most morally complicated figures in the history of science. He would win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. Today, his process feeds roughly half the world's population. The synthetic nitrogen in the food chain of approximately 4 billion people traces back to Haber-Bosch. By any measure, he did more to reduce human starvation than almost any figure in history. He also pioneered chemical warfare. During World War I, Haber personally supervised the first large-scale use of chlorine gas as a weapon. At the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, he oversaw the deployment of 168 tons of gas that drifted into Allied trenches and killed roughly 6,000 soldiers in the most horrific way imaginable, their lungs filling with fluid, drowning from the inside. His wife Clara, also a chemist and one of the first women in Germany to earn a doctorate, was horrified. She had spent months urging him to abandon the weapons program, calling it a perversion of science. The night after he returned home from supervising a gas attack on the Western Front, she shot herself in their garden. Haber left the next morning to oversee another gas attack on the Eastern Front. Later, his nitrogen chemistry would contribute to the synthesis of Zyklon A, the precursor to Zyklon B, the gas used in Nazi death camps. Haber himself was Jewish and was forced to flee Germany in 1933 when the Nazis came to power. He died in exile in 1934, a broken man, rejected by the country he had served so completely. This is the man who destroyed Chile's monopoly. Progress does not come from simple heroes. Sometimes it comes from figures so contradictory that we barely know how to hold them in our minds. A Nobel laureate who gassed soldiers, a man who fed billions and helped enable genocide. The same chemistry that makes your food possible made the weapons that killed millions. That is the actual story behind the invention that ended Chile's empire. When World War I began in 1914, Britain's Royal Navy did something that would echo far beyond the battlefields of Europe. It blockaded Germany. German supply lines to South America were cut. The Chilean nitrate ships couldn't reach Hamburg, and Germany, which depended on Chilean saltpeter for both fertilizer and ammunition, suddenly faced a catastrophic shortage. Military strategists had predicted that if this happened, Germany would run out of gunpowder within months and be forced to surrender. They were wrong, because Haber's process existed. Because Bosch's factories were already producing synthetic ammonia at scale, Germany didn't need Chile anymore. It had learned to breathe nitrogen out of thin air. The blockade that was supposed to end the war in 1914 instead prolonged it for 4 more years. The same scientific breakthrough that was meant to end hunger extended one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Haber-Bosch kept Germany fighting and kept the Western Front grinding through 4 more years of industrial slaughter. Somewhere in this equation is a lesson about the unintended consequences of invention that makes simple narratives about progress feel dangerously naive. And somewhere in Chile, the nitrate revenue was still flowing, for now, as the world went to war without needing to ask Chile for permission. By the 1920s, the price of Chilean nitrate had begun its long fall. By the 1930s, with the Great Depression crushing commodity prices worldwide, it had collapsed entirely. Economics tells you. Mines closed, unemployment rose, government revenue fell. What economics doesn't tell you is what happened to the people. In the Atacama Desert, the nitrate industry hadn't just created jobs, it had created entire worlds. The nitrate offices, called oficinas, were self-contained company towns carved into the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. They had schools, hospitals, theaters, libraries, football pitches. Workers had union halls. Families had raised multiple generations in these places. Communities had cemeteries. Today, many of those towns are still there, exactly as they were left. When the mines closed, people walked out and never came back. Furniture remained in houses. Tools remained in workshops. Ledgers remained open on office desks. The theater in Humberstone, one of the best preserved ghost towns, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, still has its seats, its stage, and a swimming pool built from a ship's hull hauled across the desert. More than 100 oficinas exist in various states of abandonment across the Atacama. They are some of the most haunting places on Earth. Each one represents a community that was built on the assumption that the resource would last forever. Each one represents families who had no plan B, because the industry that employed them had never imagined needing one. The workers didn't cause this. The miners didn't choose to build a civilization in a desert and then abandon it. They were the last people to know the monopoly was ending, The political class and business elite had decades of warning. The laboratory work in Germany, the rising synthetic production, the falling prices. Those at the top understood what was coming far earlier than those at the bottom. But the workers paid the price. Entire families migrated south to Santiago and Valparaiso, arriving in cities that had no capacity to absorb them. Shantytowns grew, social tension rose, the political instability that would define Chilean politics for decades. The coups, the left-right conflicts, the trauma of the 1970s had roots stretching back to the collapse of the nitrate economy and the dispossessed working class it left behind. Now look at the world today. Saudi Arabia sits on the largest conventional oil reserves on the planet. For decades, its government has warned publicly, in official documents, that it needs to diversify. Vision 2030, launched in 2016, is a formal acknowledgement that oil will not last forever and that the economy must find new pillars. Venezuela was once the wealthiest country in South America, with oil reserves that dwarf Saudi Arabia's. Today, it is one of the most economically devastated nations on earth, with millions of citizens having fled as refugees. The oil didn't run out. The political system built around oil revenues simply couldn't survive when prices fell. Nigeria has earned over $1 trillion in oil revenue since the 1970s. Its per capita income is lower today, in real terms, than it was before the oil boom. The resource wealth actually stunted the development of everything else, manufacturing, agriculture, services, by making those sectors unnecessary and uncompetitive. These are not countries with uniquely bad people or unusually corrupt leaders. They are countries trapped in the same institutional incentives that Chile faced with nitrate. The money flows. The political class protects the money. Diversification is perpetually deferred. And when technology changes, or the price collapses, or the world simply decides it doesn't need what you're selling, there is nothing else. Chile's white gold is being replayed in black gold, and in green lithium, and in rare earth minerals. The resource changes. The story doesn't. Which brings us to a question worth sitting with. What does Chile's Atacama Desert produce today? Lithium. The same desert, the same country, a different white powder. The Atacama salt flats hold roughly 37% of known global lithium reserves. Lithium is the critical material in every EV battery, every smartphone, every grid-scale energy storage system for the clean energy transition. If you wanted to design a perfect metaphor for everything we've discussed, you couldn't improve on this. But the question is whether Chile has actually learned anything. Sodium-ion batteries, which don't require lithium, are advancing rapidly. Solid-state batteries may require entirely different materials. Lab-grown alternatives are being explored on multiple continents. The Atacama may be sitting on the next white gold, or it may be sitting on the next sodium nitrate, and Chile may not yet know which one it is. That uncertainty is not paranoia. It is history repeating its opening question. After the nitrate collapse, Chile fell into copper and made many of the same mistakes again. The nationalization battles of the 1960s and 70s, which culminated in Allende's expropriation of the copper mines, and then Pinochet's brutal reversal. These were the nitrate crisis playing out again with different actors and far more blood. But over decades, Chile did something few resource-dependent countries have managed. It slowly, painfully built institutions designed to survive commodity cycles. The Copper Stabilization Fund, which saves excess revenue in good years to cushion the economy in bad years, is now considered one of the most effective sovereign wealth mechanisms. Chile diversified into agriculture, wine, salmon farming, and technology services. It built a more independent central bank and more transparent fiscal rules. It is not a perfect story. Chile still has deep inequality and political volatility. But compared to Venezuela, to Nigeria, to most of the world's resource states, Chile's long arc demonstrates that the resource curse is not a sentence. It is a tendency. The difference between a resource trap and a resource opportunity is always the same thing. Institutions built before the money runs out, not after. Chile learned this the hardest possible way. Most countries are still in the middle of learning it. There is a line that deserves to become something larger than a closing sentence. The real product is not the resource. Germany proved this when it took a monopoly built on geography and replaced it with a monopoly built on knowledge. The Haber-Bosch process wasn't just chemistry. It was a nation saying, we don't need your desert. We have laboratories. The real product is always the capability, the human knowledge, the institutional infrastructure, the culture of problem solving. That allows a country to create value regardless of what the ground contains or doesn't contain. South Korea has almost no natural resources. Singapore has none. Taiwan has almost none. They have some of the highest living standards and most dynamic economies, built entirely on the capability of their people and their institutions. Congo sits on perhaps the richest mineral deposits on Earth. Cobalt, coltan, diamonds, gold, and has been one of the most conflict-ridden, poverty-stricken nations in the world for generations. The resource is not the answer. It can be the trap. Fritz Haber understood this intuitively, even if his own story was defined by irreducible paradox. He spent his career turning ambient air, the most common, universally available substance on Earth, into the most strategically valuable chemical compound of his era. He didn't need a desert, he needed a mind. Walk through Humberstone today and you'll find a theater that still has its curtains. A swimming pool shaped like an ocean liner, a clock tower that stopped at some specific hour when the last person left and no one ever came back to wind it again. That clock is one of the most honest economic monuments ever built. It marks the precise moment an economy believed it was permanent and froze. Chile was not uniquely foolish. It was simply the first modern economy to discover that a monopoly built on geography could be dissolved overnight by a laboratory on another continent. It paid a price that shaped its politics, its class structure, and its national trauma for a century. Every generation since has faced the same fundamental choice: learn the lesson or wait to become someone else's case study. The oil states are learning it now. The lithium states will learn it next. The technology platforms that believe their user bases are permanent moats are encountering their own version of it in real time. Technology always chases monopoly. Capital always follows disruption. And somewhere, in a laboratory you've never heard of, in a country you might struggle to place on a map, someone is working on the process that makes your most valuable asset obsolete. The question is never whether that moment is coming. The question is whether you'll have built something real before it arrives. An invention once made air more valuable than desert. The next invention is already underway, and the only permanent advantage is the refusal